Can I ask my question?
Sure you can.
Okay, so in childhood, we're like raised by our caregivers, so we can absorb a lot of their ways of dealing with stress. This is not what my question is about yet. What I'm leading is, we get these layers built on top of the truth because there can be trauma and it can be too much to feel in the moment. Or is that not, like, would you say that's wrong? How do you define, like, how does childhood trauma happen? Is there too much pain and we can't feel it, and so we start building these layers on top of it? Is it because the truth is too painful?
No.
Or are we actually equipped with it and we disconnect from it? Like, I just want to know your stand on that.
Yeah, sure. It's not because there's too much pain. It's because we've been taught that we're incapable of feeling that pain. So the problem is that during childhood, you've got to remember you're growing up in an environment where your parents are just terrified of their own feelings. Most of the time, they're just terrified of their own feelings. And in particular, the thing they're terrified the most of is their own sin. Because in the very long run, and also in their spirit state, in their sleep state, there is some level of consciousness in most people. They've done a whole series of things wrong, and they're going to have to pay for it at some point, right? So they're terrified of sin. They're terrified of feeling the consequences of it, right? So you're growing up as a child in that environment, but the way God created you is you're a sensitive person. You are sensitive to everything going on around you. So one of the things you're sensitive to is that you would love to feel. As a child, you love, like every child cries generally when they're born and shortly after for quite some time sometimes. And the reason why is the child loves to feel, it loves to release things. It's been created to do it almost, because the child is most connected to its soul at that point without any conscious limitation in its head, suppressing its feelings. And so it wants to feel. The child wants to feel. It can handle any grief. It's happy to cry for 4 hours. All of you parents know that, right? How many times did you put children cry for 4 hours? A lot of parents are rocking them and driving around, trying to get the car down, but the child's happy to keep just crying.
Well, maybe we can't say they necessarily have to.
It's not happy, but
they can experience that.
They're handling it.
Yes, they are handling
the level of grief that's already inside their soul. They're already handling it by letting it out. Yeah. Already doing it.
They're doing what God designed them to do to be free of it.
Yeah, already. And this is happening right from the time of birth generally, onwards. Because remember, we said they've accrued already some of that grief through what's happened in their womb, right? So what does the parent then do? So what methods do they use?
Guilt, shame.
Well, yeah, with a little child, it's hard to guilt them, isn't it? What do they do?
Oh, stop crying.
Okay, so one of the first things is calm them. The parents really just try to calm themselves down, right? Really, but so it's like calm, like trying to force calm, which is actually an unloving act. Trying to force calm on the process that the child is already in and able to do for itself, and the parent is trying to force calm. And the main reason why the parent's doing it is because the parent wants to feel calm. Because the parent's absolutely distressed that it's a bad parent while my child's crying. And it is amazing, isn't it, as a parent, those of you who've been a parent, when you're crying, when your child is crying, a lot of times you're more distressed than the child is, which means that you've got more grief than they probably have to release, right? So that's one thing. What else?
Distract.
Distract. Yeah.
Very good. Distract.
It's so common. We see that all the time when we're travelling.
Yeah.
A child might be feeling a bit upset. Here's a
Here's a lolly. Here's a tree.
Look at the birdie.
Yeah.
Look out the window. Like that kind of. And if you were crying, you imagine as an adult you were crying, and somebody's saying to you, "Look out the window." Isn't that gonna go like? Just shut up and let me feel. Is what you feel, right? What else?
I don't know if that goes under forced calm, but tell them it's not a problem, like it didn't even happen.
Yes.
Yes, like completely deny that
the truth.
There was that there was a problem at all.
Undermine their perception of what's happening.
And you could call that gaslighting, but you're doing it to a little child who doesn't even have the intellect to know what's going on, unfortunately. and you're already doing it to them. What else? Any other ideas?
Oh wow. Next to me, what's your name?
Eva? Yeah.
Just said aggression.
Aggression, yeah.
Threats of violence.
Threats.
Very violent.
Firstly, it starts with threats, doesn't it? Threat. And then for many of us, me included, there's been actual violence. But now you think about actual violence from a parent to a child. In law, if you're violent physically to another person as an adult, you get put in jail generally, or you go to court for it. And yet, how many children, like, on the same level, we've got these little tiny kids who are getting hammered by their parents oftentimes, belted, for the justification in my childhood, and I did that with my own children too, was religious justification, spare the rod, spoil the child, that kind of thing. All sorts of violent justifications to be violent towards children. So actual violence. All right, what else? Any ideas? So these are the main ones, right? Aren't they? Yep.
There's lots of ways those things come about, aren't they?
Aren't they?
Yeah.
Right. But you just look at those 5 things for a moment. Let's say we've just given it a brief thought, and the other 5 things that sort of pop up at the moment. You're a child. Imagine what effect that is having on you about your calm, about feeling emotion. Like, it's intense on the child. And you can understand why by the time the child's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age, it doesn't know how to connect to any of its own emotions or have any confidence in itself at all.
You lose the confidence to feel you can feel anything because you're taken away from that natural process so often that then when now emotion comes up in you, you're now worried about not only are all these things going to happen to me, I'm going to be told it's not true, or I now have to question even if it's true, what bad thing is going to happen to me if I feel this. But also, it's like when you're riding a bike, the more you do it, the more confident you are. You just get on and ride. You just get on and you don't even have to think about it. But if we're shut down from that process of learning to ride the bike, every time we just start to get it going and someone knocks us off, we don't know that we can get beyond a few pedal pushes, do we? And so then we think, it was too much for me to cope with my childhood. But actually we were taken away from coping with our childhood, sometimes violently, and even the forced calm can be very violent towards a child, can be very violent, even if it's done in supposedly dulcet tones, soft tones. The feeling sometimes coming from a mother who's trying to comfort her child is often quite aggressive, isn't it? Shut up, basically.
Not only aggressive, there's a very strong withdrawal of love that occurs with all of these. A very strong withdrawal of love from the parent to the child, which the child is the most sensitive to because it's so young. And it feels like if a parent withdraws love from a child, the child's life is now threatened. It's very survival. If the parent doesn't love the child's very survival on earth is threatened. That's how severe it is for the child, right? So the truth is, you wanted to say more. The truth is that as these are the things that we actually don't want to feel, so they're the grief, and then we put a fear on it that says, I can't do it because of my parents.
Or I can't cope with it. I didn't have the capacity. It was too much.
I didn't have the capacity. So in that fear, you're blaming yourself for what the parents did. Rather than the grief is, the parents did this. That's the grief. And coming to face that and feel that and go the way through it and come to face inside of yourself that actually a lot of the grief that I'm avoiding is actually truth that I'm avoiding about my life.
And this...
You're going to say?
Yeah, it's really then a process of re-establishing that connection with your emotions to eventually get to being able to feel the whole truth.
That's right.
But I wonder if that's just a process rather than you being able to face that all at once.
It is a process,
yeah.
I agree. But you've got to be very careful that you don't use your fears to justify not going through the process, which is what most people do. So what most people do is they say, it was right for me to be afraid of my parents. And I'm going, well, as a child it might have been right, because it's pretty scary, right? But as an adult, if you carry this with you as an adult, it's going to damage the rest of your life. You're going to do all of this to other people probably. There's a heap of things you will do to avoid the truth of your own life, but you also encourage others to avoid theirs as well. There's a whole lot of unlovingness, a whole lot of sin that you don't commit while these feelings are there, but you don't deal with them. So the fear is saying, I don't have to deal with it. Right? The grief, the truth of the grief is, yes, you do. Yes, you do. You have to come face to face with the fact that your parents did these things. And to be frank, most parents on earth did these things, maybe with the exception of the fifth, number 5, but they pretty much did everything else. Right? Almost every one of you, well, I'd say every one of you, from what I can feel, has had these experiences in your childhood. And this is very scary for a very sensitive soul, which is what the child is, who is in a state of fairly connected to what love is as well. Remember, by the time he's born, he's usually in the 4th or 5th sphere in terms of his measure of love. And so he's measuring what's coming from the hells without being able to understand it. He's measuring what's coming from the hells emotionally, and this is like life-threatening stuff coming from the hells, from his parents, into him. And of course, he's scared to death of feeling emotion in that moment, but that's the grief he's avoiding through the fear. So,
yeah.
Yep.
And maybe we can extend it, Jay, if we draw some more griefs down here.
Yep.
So, if you like, all of these things, if they're in our environment as a kid, which they are, they become, that it's like we're in that soup all the time, aren't we? Now, individual, actually big things can happen also that are what some people call traumatic events.
Such as like getting abused,
yes.
Or being belted, even, the
yes.
child being belted.
Even the loss of the death of a parent, or the car accident, or, bullying at school.
Physical events.
Yeah, physical, actual sort of what we could call maybe more isolated events. They can form things that get shut down in us. But the reality is we're also already in this soup of things that we have a grief about as well.
That's all getting suppressed already.
Yes. And there's patterns also within our family that cause different types of grief. So if we had an overbearing dad and an absent mother, or we'll have particular griefs relating to those things. But we have to be careful that we don't. So we know the truth, or I know the truth, that in order for me to heal and become a loving, truthful person, I'm going to need to deal with all the griefs that are inside of me. But the
actual cause of them.
The actual cause of these things, that happened. And also, as an adult now, I'm going to have grief about things that I've done to other people that are actually in me as well.
And that's also a part of the sin that's stored in there as well.
Yes. And you could call them, what I'm doing is putting them in a layer underneath this grief, which is all of my grief, really, if you think about how I was treated when I was emotional, when I was a child. But I think what I'm wanting to say to you, Aria, is we have to be careful that we don't sort of, in our fear, say, well, it's all too much to deal with that stuff because we've got all these problems with this grief about feeling emotion, if you like, as well. When the reality is, it is our responsibility to deal with all that grief. And as you said, it's going to be a process. But the problem is when we're quite bound up in fear or justification, we get to the initial grief about feeling feelings, and we go, well, it wasn't safe for me to feel feelings. How can I be expected to feel the actual problems in my life as well? And the truth is, we can do it.
We also get quite focused on justifying us not wanting to feel the grief associated with our sin as well. So we're not prepared, as you were doing earlier, feeling some of the grief about the actual sin, the abortion, for example. This is a very important process too, because usually what people do in this state here is they justify all their sin and justify not looking at the cause of it and justify not feeling things that actually happen, the truth of their grief. So they justify, in this state of fear, they justify almost everything as to why they shouldn't change something. Now, it is true that as you grow, you will gradually become more aware of things. That is a natural process of your growth, right? But you've got to be careful that you're not using that excuse of gradual progress to actually excuse looking at a whole heap of things, which is what most people do.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The question is just, as a child, can a child start this process? Like, I think there would need to be assistance to let them know that it's safe to feel their emotions.
This would have to change.
Yeah.
As
a child, it's almost impossible unless you have a parent who's changed. So we have seen some parents actually, like Eloisa is probably a good example, where she started to change a lot. So this is Eloisa, who is now one of the managers we have in God's Way in Australia, and she's a good friend of ours. But when she first started, her kids were, I think one was just born, one was 2, one was 5, 4, when she started to look at herself, right? Now, as she worked through her different problems, she became less forcing calm, less distracting with children, less in denial.
Less distracting of her own emotions, less denying of her own emotions, less...
Because there's also, in amongst this, a lot of people don't realise, and this is a big problem nowadays, is that these aren't the only ways to get a child out of their stuff. Another way is to feed a whole lot of demands in the child, to actually give the child a whole heap of things that it comes to expect that it shouldn't be getting. You understand? And this is actually an area where most people don't even look at all, right? Where they've sort of projected or given to the child a whole heap of actions or feelings that actually, if you do it, it causes a child to enter expectations. So we now see little 2-year-olds bossing their entire family as a result of that, right? And that's even worse than some of these things, because it has such a powerful effect on how they treat others in their later life. So you could call it, you're basically letting your child be a bully, right? And things like that. And that can be very damaging as well. So what happens though is you're starting, when these things have happened, and there's all sorts of things, you could say that were negative to the child, but also perceived as positive, given to the child, which are actually not positive, and all those things given cause the child then to enter its own sin, right? And its own sin is going to also have grief associated with it. Now, if the parent does not deal with these, you can see the parent's going to continue projecting all of these things on the child. The child's in a very unsafe environment. How can we expect it to change? You can't expect it to change. The only change that's really going to happen is after it leaves its home and moves on with its life. And the more removed from its parents it is, the more higher the chance is going to be that they actually deal with some of it, right? If they stay bound to their parent forever, or for their entire life, often they won't deal with it their entire life, and they'll deal with it in the spirit world, right? But if the parent creates an environment now, and actually the parent does their own work dealing with their own grief and comes to no longer accept their own fear as a justification for their sin, that has a great effect on the child, right? And so by the time they might have had damage, 2 years of age or early, and then the parent begins this process. By the time the child's 12, almost all of its injuries will be only its own, and nothing to do with the parent, if the parent has worked through all those things. And this is a very good gift as parents that you give your children. The gift of, imagine if you did that before you have a child, that would be fantastic. But if you haven't, and many of us who become parents haven't, so if you deal with it after, you're giving them the best opportunity to make change. But you're dead right, Aria. If all of these things are happening as a child, and if the environment does not change, it's going to be very, very hard.
There's going to be a lot to deal with once you move out.
Correct.
Yes.
And you'll start dealing with probably once you move out, and in particular once you start connecting to other families, seeing other things happening in the world, and having some experience in the world, you start looking at your own family and going, oh, it wasn't that good here and it wasn't that good there. And so you start critiquing things a bit as an adult. But unfortunately, there's also been the added problem in that we've become so afraid of our own emotion, right, that we start using fear of our own emotion as a justification to not deal with that as well. So it's tough. So we're recognising it's tough, but it is a very good experience for your health, for your long-term life, not just your life now on earth, but your future life in the spirit world, and also for your joy, to develop over time. This is why it's such an important experience. But the main problems we face from God's perspective is the justification of our sin, and our fear is the main way we do it. It's the main way we do it.
Yeah. Right, this applies once we're adults primarily.
Yeah.
Okay, there's lots of questions. I want to give the mic over.
Yeah, so can we come to Olga down the front on this side and Charlotte on this side there?